Briar Rose. Long, long ago there lived a king and a queen. Day after day they said to each other, "Oh, if only we could have a child." But nothing ever happened. One day, while the queen was bathing, a frog crawled out of the water, up to shore, and said to her,
Your wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year goes by, you will give birth to a daughter.
The frog's prediction came true, and the queen gave birth to a girl who was so beautiful that the king was beside himself with joy and arranged a great feast. He invited relatives, friends, and acquaintances, and he also sent for the wise women of the kingdom, for he wanted to be sure that they would be kindly disposed towards his child. There were 13 wise women in all, but since the king had only 12 golden plates for them to dine on, one of the women had to stay home. The feast was celebrated with great splendor, and when it drew to a close, the wise women bestowed their magic wisdom. One conferred virtue on her, a second gave her beauty, a third wealth, and on it went until the girl had everything in the world you could ever want. Just as the 11th woman was presenting her gift, the 13th in the group appeared out of nowhere. She had not been invited, and now she wanted her revenge. Without so much as a greeting or even a glance at anyone there, she cried out in a loud voice,
When the daughter of the king turns 15, she will prick her finger on a spindle and fall down dead.
and without another word she turned her back on those assembled and left the hall. Everyone was horrified. But just in the nick of time, the 12th of the wise women stepped forward. She had not yet made her wish. Although she could not lift the evil spell, she could temper it, and so she said, "The princess will not die, but she will fall into a deep sleep that will last for 100 years." The king, who had intended on preventing any harm from coming to his child, sent an order that every spindle in the entire kingdom was to be burned to ashes. As for the girl, all the wishes made by the wise woman came true, for she was so beautiful, kind, charming, and sensible that everyone who set eyes on her could not help but love her. On the very day that the princess turned 15, the king and the queen happened to be away from home, and the girl was left all alone. She wandered around in the castle, poking her head into one room after another, and eventually she came to the foot of an old tower. After climbing up a narrow winding staircase in the tower, she ended up in front of a little door with a rusty old key in its lock. As she turned the key, the door burst open to reveal a tiny little room in which an old woman was sitting with her spindle, busily spinning flax. "Good afternoon, Granny," said the princess. "What are you doing here?"
I'm spinning flax,
the old woman replied, and she nodded to the girl. "What is that thing bobbing about so oddly?" asked the girl, and she put her hand on the spindle, for she too wanted to spin. The magic spell began to take effect at once, for she had pricked her finger on the spindle. The instant she felt the prick on her finger, she slumped down on the bed that was in the room, and a deep sleep came over her. The sleep spread through the entire castle. The king and the queen, who had just returned home and were entering the hall, fell asleep, and their attendants along with them. The horses fell asleep in the stables, the dogs in the courtyard, the doves on the roof, the flies on the walls, and yes, indeed, even the fire flickered and the hearth died down and fell asleep, and the roast stopped sizzling, and the cook, who was about to pull the hair of the kitchen boy because he had done something stupid, let go and fell asleep. The wind also died down so that not a leaf was stirring on the trees outside the castle. Soon a hedge of briars began to grow all around the castle. Every year it grew higher, until one day it surrounded the entire place. It had grown so thick that you could not even see the banner on the turret of the castle. Throughout the land stories circulated about the beautiful Briar Rose, for that was the name given to the slumbering princess. From time to time a prince would try to force his way through the hedge to get to the castle, but no one ever succeeded, because the briars clasped each other as if they were holding hands, and the young men who tried got caught in them and couldn't pry themselves loose. They died an agonizing death. After many, many years had passed, another prince appeared in the land. He heard an old man talking about a briar hedge that was said to conceal a castle, where a wondrously beautiful princess named Briar Rose had been sleeping for 100 years, and with her the king, the queen, and the entire court. The old man had learned from his grandfather that many other princes had tried to make their way through the briar hedge, but they had gotten caught on the briars and perished in horrible ways. The young man said, "I'm not afraid. I'm going to find that castle so that I can see the beautiful Briar Rose." The kind old man did his best to discourage the prince, but he refused to listen. It so happened that the term of 100 years had just ended, and the day on which Briar Rose was to awaken had arrived. When the prince approached the briar hedge, he found nothing but big, beautiful flowers. They opened to make a path for him, and to let him pass unharmed. Then they closed behind him to form a hedge. In the courtyard the horse and the spotted hounds were lying in the same place fast asleep, and the doves were roosting with their heads tucked under their wings. The prince made his way into the castle and saw how the flies were fast asleep on the walls. The cook was still in the kitchen with his hands up in the air as if he were about to grab the kitchen boy, and the maid was still sitting at a table with a black hen that she was about to pluck. The prince walked along a little farther, over to the great hall where he saw the entire court fast asleep, with the king and the queen sleeping right next to their thrones. He continued on his way, and everything was so quiet that he could hear his own breath. Finally he got to the tower, and he opened up the door to the little room in which Briar Rose was sleeping. There she lay, so beautiful that he could not take his eyes off her, and he bent down to kiss her. No sooner had the prince touched Briar Rose's lips than she woke up, opened her eyes, and smiled sweetly at him. They went down the stairs together. The king, the queen, and the entire court had awoken, and they were all staring at each other in amazement. The horses in the courtyard stood up and shook themselves. The hounds jumped to their feet and wagged their tails. The doves pulled their head out from under their wings, looking around, and flew off into the fields. The flies began crawling on the walls. The fire in the kitchen flared up, and began cooking the food again. The roast started to sizzle, and the cook slapped the boy so hard that he let out a screech. The maid finished plucking the hen. The wedding of Briar Rose and the prince was celebrated in great splendor, and the two lived out their days in happiness.